This is Jack Burton in the Pork Chop Express, and I'm talking to whoever's listening out there. It's a pretty amazing planet we live on here, and a man would have to be some kind of fool to think we're all alone in this universe.
There is a hidden world where ancient evil weaves a modern mystery.
What's going on here? Is this some kind of
magic? The darkest magic.
They call it Little China.
Finally, we shall bring order out of chaos.
It's where Big Trouble was waiting for Jack Burton.
Who? Jack Burton. Me.
Jack?
Jack?
Jack!
They told him to go to hell.
You make one move.
And that's just where he's going.
Somebody, I don't care who, tell me what is going on.
Howdy, folks. Your host, Double J, back here, coming at you live from my studio/RV dining room, located just outside the city of Little Port-au-Prince, Ohio, formerly known as Springfield, Ohio. I will be your host, folks of the interwebs. I will be your pilot and navigator for tonight's shenanigan infused journey into the mind of this particular garbage can dude. And we'll be discussing the one of my favorite films, the cinematic masterpiece, the 1986 cinematic masterpiece, Big Trouble in Little China. We're going to be doing an occult and esoteric review of the film here this evening. And joining me here is Nick, the host of the Occult Rejects, and Jin, the host of the Threshold Saints podcast. And I'll turn it over here to you fellas to introduce yourselves. Nick, appreciate you joining me. Jen, appreciate you joining me here. Looking forward to the conversation.
Oh yeah, thank you for asking me to come on and co-host with you. Appreciate it.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, thank you so much, JJ, and thank you, Nick. It's a lot of pressure to be with a senior reject and my boss.
Hello, Occult Rejects, absolutely. All right, well, Nick, do you want to give a quick introduction here for folks who may not know the Occult Rejects and what we're referring to here, Jen and myself, as being fellow rejects?
That's true, man. Yeah, this is like three people from the Occult Rejects podcast already. But yeah, the Occult Rejects, that was a show that I started, and it ended up growing it into a Wu-Tang version of podcasting. And I do have JJ Vance and Jin the Ninja, very two important rejects on that show. Yeah, the Occult Rejects, BitChute, YouTube, Rumble, and all major podcasts. Thank you very much, JJ.
Absolutely. Appreciate it, Nick. Appreciate it. And, now I look back at all the hours we've talked about, a lot of the true crime and stuff we've covered on the Occult Rejects. I look back at some of the total volume of work we've done. We've actually done quite a bit over the last 18 months.
Dude, we've done
actually, I'm not gonna lie to you. It's kind of an impressive body of work. I'm not gonna lie to you.
Well,
I am part of it, so I'm somewhat biased, but.
Well, what part? You remember one point when we were, I think, working on the Smiley Face Killers, I was like, I think I had even told you, I was like, I'm really sorry. I think you're actually like doing more on this than your own show. I was like, I don't think this is putting anything out for a few weeks. I felt bad.
That's true. I was having a good time doing the work with you, putting out some of those shows. So definitely enjoyed it and definitely appreciated all that. Jen, appreciate you joining us here again. And can you introduce yourself here and the Threshold Saints? I know we've interacted before in podcasts over there on the Clint Eastwood show and whatnot. Had numerous discussions, but I don't believe this is the first time we've never podcasted on the same podcast together on the Occult Rejects. So I definitely appreciate you joining here tonight. And I want you to give a quick introduction to some of your work there, bud.
Sure. So thank you so much, JJ. Thank you again. And Nick,
sure.
Obviously. And so I'm Jin the Ninja. I host a show called Threshold Saints. I just dropped an episode with my friend KB Goldtooth, who's a kind of I'm calling him a new media philosopher, a British journalist guy. And we're looking at the way in which sort of media and what Tracy Twyman called like interactive or simulated reality games. So he
Oh.
went to this ABBA exhibit and basically he wrote about it, and then we discussed it. And it was a really strong episode for me. And I just want to shout out my homie Monte Carlo from the Nice Podcast, and Dingbat from Weeb Chat, and Organized Meat. And all those guys will be on my show very soon. Monty and I have an ongoing series about occultism and anime. So obviously I'm going to draw a little bit of my experience from that when I do this.
Excellent. And you were mentioning ABBA, like the band ABBA?
So there was this, like, I guess it's a museum installation that was going around Europe. So they have like life-size holograms and sort of like interactive colors, and it's like a dance floor, and they play ABBA music. And so he wondered if that was a form of occultism. And because obviously this is something that Nick and I often discuss, is like, yes, the media is a kind of magic that is, but it's you can sort of bypass it if you're aware of it. If you're like aware of where your will is and like what the input is, I think you can sort of overcome it. So that's sort of, I kind of magic pilled him is what I'm trying to say. I kind of, we try and look at realistically without fear mongering.
Yeah. Just to kind of tee up tonight's conversation along some of those similar lines, Nick and I recently did a show here a couple weeks back on Operation GCD Live, the Stoner Noir film review, where we kind of went over the genre known as Stoner Noir, this kind of bumbling detective who happens to stumble his way through solving a mystery, if you will, and is often inebriated while doing so. Was kind of the salient characteristics we established, I believe, right, Nick? Was there anything else that I missed there, you think?
Not offhand, no.
Yeah, it was kind of the Big Lebowski was kind of, I think, was kind of like kind of the bullseye kind of the standard of the genre, if you will. So I mean, along the lines of those same concepts, tonight's film, The Big Trouble in Little China, falls along those same lines. You have a bumbling lead in Kurt Russell, Jack Burton, as you heard in the introduction here tonight, folks. And Jack Burton is he's a very confident man. He's a very leading man as far as the protagonist of the film goes. But he's stumbling and bumbling his way through essentially solving this mystery and saving this young female from a human sacrifice from some ancient wizard from China named Lo Pan. And thanks to his sidekick, Burton's really the sidekick to his martial arts expert friend, I believe his Wang Chi is his name. Please correct me if I'm missing the character's name there, Jen. And if you're familiar, no. Is that right? Wang Chi?
Yeah, his name is Wang Chi.
That's his buddy's name, right? Yeah. So Wang Chi in large part is really the protagonist, and Burton's kind of the bumbling, buffoonish character, which again falls in line with that stoner noir genre. But what I think was very interesting too is after we were having a discussion following that podcast, Jen, where you suggested this topic here tonight, and I thought it was very interesting. Some of the details I looked into what you were talking about or some of the details that went into the plot lines of Big Trouble in Little China. So it's not just peak 1980s kind of action cinema, with the flying sword fighting and the over the top kind of martial arts action that was kind of going on at the time, right? Like it's got a far more deeper things into the plot line as far as historical and potentially mystical wars there in Chinatown between what is essentially feuding wings of organized crime. Am I right there, Jen? Is that? I'll tee it off over to you. Is that a good description of kind of where we're heading with tonight's conversation and how we kind of got there?
Totally. And I totally agree with you, JJ. That's a great way to frame it. But let me just add in or build up a little foundation. So sure. There's a Cantonese, or we're calling it a Cantonese language genre of films called wuxia, but they can also be Mandarin language. But so wuxia films are basically magical swordsmen, and they do have a basis in Taoist and Buddhist cosmology, but you can sort of see like how there's a bleed over between like 1980s John Woo movies like Heroic Brotherhood films
Okay.
and like this magic swordsman genre. And actually, John Woo did direct a really interesting and really seminal wuxia film. So basically, a sword play with magic. And so, my thesis, I guess, for tonight is that this film is an American wuxia film because
Oh.
this film is very Cantonese. Like, it's not just Chinese, it's specifically Cantonese, and it's specifically Chinese American or American Chinese. So I think it's very much rooted in that kind of, maybe you could say, there's a little bit of that libertarian American spirit. Obviously, he's a truck driver, and he, there's that kind of, I guess, the stoner, exactly like what you said, the stoner noir archetype, who's like distrustful of big government, distrustful of anything he can't see with his own two eyes, to quote Jack Burton. So, I think. Sorry,
go ahead.
Go ahead. No,
go ahead. No, I think some of the mystical aspects of the film are really what were both interesting to me as a child for different reasons that it's interesting to me as an adult. But there does seem to be with this. I mean, even into the ancient Chinese lore of the former emperor, the original emperor, there was of the Qin dynasty. How do you pronounce that? QIN dynasty.
Qin dynasty.
Qin dynasty. Who apparently puts a curse on Lo Pan. And Lo Pan apparently lives as some sort of spirit or a disembodied kind of figure who can occasionally take a bodily form at times, right? Is that rooted in any kind of ancient mysticism within the Chinese culture, or is Lo Pan a completely Hollywood fiction? Because I think he's a great character as far as villains go. I mean, Lo Pan's one of the all-time, the actor that played him, he's a great character actor throughout Hollywood. Not Victor Wong. Victor Wong, that's Egg Chen. I can't think of the guy who plays Lo Pan, but he's a very, very common actor. But I thought that was the character Lo Pan was just great character.
So he clearly takes some inspiration from 30s, like the 30s kind of pulp noir films with like a Fu Manchu character. But to go back just a little bit to the point about it being a wuxia film, I think this is a really important point because it fulfills the genre convention of wuxia, and wuxia has this idea called jianghu, which is rivers and lakes. So it's sort of this underworld, maybe a supernatural underworld, maybe a martial underworld is how it's often described, that exists at the same time as normal society or sort of normal reality. And there's these wizards or these swords people or these Taoist immortals. They exist in our sort of regular everyday life, but we just don't, because we're not part of the martial society, we don't know. So I just think that this is interesting because Lo Pan is also the name of the Chinese, or specifically the Cantonese god. So he is a deified real person that really existed, and he is the deified god of Chinese Freemasonry. And so you have some very interesting, I think you have a very interesting kind of plot point right out the bat. But I will point out
that's a deep esotericism, right? They're going to get, that's kind of right on the nose of esotericism. If I didn't realize Lo Pan was an actual, not only a god figure, but a Freemasonic figure as well within the Chinese culture.
He is a literal like Mason. Like that is like that. If you give him a deity office, he is the deity of actual stonemasonry and building. So that's really interesting, and engineering as well. And his name in Cantonese, Lo Pan, can also refer to triads, like a sort of a boss, like a big boss. That's one of the meanings of the name. So it has that because Chinese love a homophone. Everything in Chinese is basically a homophone. So you find this a lot with all Chinese cinema is basically they make a lot of word games. And so it's interesting because two non-Chinese fellows wrote this film, but they clearly had some knowledge or they consulted someone who understood the story that they were trying to tell. Because it's all throughout the entire film. It's even the name of the Tongs. It's the name of the characters. There's a lot there.
And now the Tongs play an important role in this film as far as underlings to this Lo Pan mystic, overlord god creature, right? Because I mean, he's both man and kind of demon at the same time, right? He's existed for hundreds of years, and he's employing these organized crime outfits in Chinatown and San Francisco that have a basis in history, right? With these Tong outfits, these various family kind of organized crime, right? Is that am I explaining these Tong outfits correctly? Is there a specific translation for the word Tong? Does that mean family or something? Or
it can mean organization or society. Now there are more modern Chinese words to describe their organizations. If you look at my Twitter name right now, there is a version, I will say, using my name and making kind of a wordplay on the secret society. So in Chinese, obviously. So basically they started out as ethnic, sort of like sub or minority ethnic factions in southern China, so like Guangdong or Canton province. And so there was 2 primary factions, but 3, I'll explain the third. So one is Cantonese. So you have these Cantonese, which are benevolent societies that are basically based on your last name. So and
these
then
are basically ethnic groups within the Chinese culture. Ethnic groups.
Yeah, ethnic groups within the Chinese culture. So mostly southern ethnic groups. So Cantonese people are from, obviously Canton is their name, or Guangdong. So when they went overseas, they brought these benevolent societies with them, which were, funded by people in their villages, maybe wealthier businessmen who would sort of set up shops, set up laundries. The Cantonese were the ones who came to America during the gold rush. So that's a very interesting, I think, ties in very well with this story of California being sort of a second spiritual home for Cantonese people, or at least in the popular imaginary. But at this time, China was really
okay. Well, if may I interject real quick, Jen? I mean, just going to San Francisco. I mean, have you been to San Francisco before? Or you visited there before?
Yes, I visited San Francisco before.
Nice. So, I mean, one of the first times I went, I've been there quite a bit. I love that city. Not so much what it's turned into recently, but it's pretty apparent though, even when like the first time going there, how much the Chinese culture had an impact in the founding of that city. I mean, it's not a new, you know what I mean? Like there was the 1840s gold rush that went out there, but if I'm not mistaken, there was some Chinese culture already set up along the ports from San Francisco to Seattle, Portland, and Seattle by that point in time.
Absolutely. So this is something I know quite a bit about, is like early Chinese settlement in North America, which is probably not that interesting for your audience. But what I think is interesting is you're right, JJ, is that they're so Victoria, BC is the oldest Chinatown in North America, although it's not necessarily like a Chinatown size like New York or San Francisco or Toronto or even Vancouver, but it is the oldest. So then you have Vancouver Chinatown is the second oldest, and then so they were basically it was on the Mormon Trail. I mean, they didn't really come from the west, but you do see a lot of Cantonese settlements throughout. Well, I'm going to use Canada, but Alberta, there's many, and was one in Lethbridge, Edmonton, Calgary, Gravelbourg. There's all these little Chinatowns that dotted the prairies.
Basically, the west coast of both countries, then, right? Canada and the U.S. Then is what you're describing.
Yeah, basically the west and the western states. It was just that there were because. Well, there's a mythological element to it as well, because even as Egg Shen describes when he's driving the bus, the Cantonese came here because they called it, I'm going to use the Mandarin because that's the dialect I'm better at. But so he calls it Jinshan, which is also my name, not my full name, but Jin. And so it means gold mountain. So it's like a golden mountain, like an immortal's mountain, like a forged, even you could say a Masonic mountain with like a double G. So there's an element there that is mythological, and that was the name originally for all of California, or specifically Northern California.
Interesting. Nick, did you have something? You were looked like you were plotting on something there. You picked up with Masonic Mountain. Does that mean anything within Masonry?
I just didn't know, so I thought that was pretty interesting.
No, it's super interesting. I just think it's important, Jen, to kind of lay that baseline to understand the politics of the situation, or the parapolitics.
100%. And I should also add, sorry, JJ.
No, go ahead.
I should just add that the Tongs, what they became was different than how they started out. So they really did start out as benevolent societies in order to help the Cantonese like resettle across not just America, but in certain places in Africa, Southeast Asia, et cetera, et cetera.
Because the Cantonese, they were pushed out politically speaking from China at that time. Was that what it was? The sport of the Cantonese?
Well, this is an interesting question because you have other ethnic groups that also went abroad. So you have the Hokkien, who are they're the biggest minority Chinese population in Southeast Asia. So when you go to Southeast Asia, like Thailand, in Bangkok and specifically, Bangkok was actually founded by Chinese merchants. And most Thai people from northern Thailand, not northern Thailand as in like the rural, but northern like Bangkok and Chiang Mai, they're actually ethnic Chinese rather than ethnic Thai, or at least mixed.
Are we talking Taiwanese Chinese? We talking mainland Chinese? What kind of Chinese
mainland Chinese. And so interestingly, Taiwan does play also a big role, as I'm sure you know, especially in the formation of the Tongs and the Triads. But so you had different.
And that's where I was getting at, because you have all these cultures coming to America and setting up these Chinatowns, but it's not one culture though, right? It's as you're establishing, this is various Chinese cultures that are coming into America and setting up these different Tong groups, these different political factions, if you will, powerful factions.
And it's really interesting to note that the Cantonese were as I said, China was really ruled by warlords. Yes, it had a monarchy, but it was weak and decentralized. So there was the Cantonese ethnicity was in the midst of a war, a small-scale guerrilla war with what are called Hakka people. Hakka people originally came from northwestern China. So they had been in southern China for like 800 years. So this was really just more ethnic rivalry, different villages between the mountains, and they speak a different dialect. So there's like a natural animosity, I guess. And so those were called the Hakka Punti Wars. This is the historical kind of term for those skirmishes. So they actually carried the ethnic conflict also with them to the Chinatowns. So this was actually a big part of why the Triads also became the Tongs, the benevolent societies also became the Triads. And then, of course, the influence of the British opium trade and the parapolitical British West India Corporation and the British East India Corporation, this all played a big role in sort of the establishment of the Triads and their underground activity. But originally, they were mostly used for resettlement, as I said, helping not to resettle, but to help people adjust to the new world. But then they were also used as anti-Manchu sort of revolutionary groups to overthrow the Manchu bureaucracy and the Manchu government of the time. Because the Qing dynasty, which was the last, if anyone's ever seen that film, The Last Emperor, that's about the Qing dynasty. So he was not ethnic Chinese. He was actually an ethnic Manchu, as most of the rulers of China were, actually. And they were Mongol, Manchu. Some had a little bit more Han ethnicity, like more ethnic Chinese ethnicity. But really, it's actually very surprising. You look through Golden Age of China, which was the Tang and the Song dynasty. It was very little ethnic Han rulership. It was much more Manchurian bloodlines, Mongolian, Kirtan, Jurchen. So it's really northern Chinese. Maybe you can even say it's northern China versus southern China.
And so that's definitely then deep into the storyline here within Big Trouble in Little China, because that's who this last emperor is, who in the plot line here is who cursed Lo Pan, the evil looking fella in the background of the image. But so he it's interesting. So this connection between this Lo Pan figure as a Chinese Freemasonry figure and the Triads. So how does the Triads kind of figure into Freemasonry? Because that seems to play right in line with the Tong groups, right? There seems to be some sort of symbiotic relationship between these groups, right? The Triad, Chinese Freemasonry, and these Tong groups in America.
So the Tong groups function very much like a secret society, especially in the anti-Manchu period, because they were obviously revolutionary in some ways of thinking groups. So they were trying to overthrow the government. And so they were very secret. They take oaths. They pray to a specific deity, not necessarily Lo Pan. That's more of a Cantonese or Hong Kong specific deity. And in fact,
Okay.
I was not even aware of the hymn until much later on in my life. Usually the deity that is assigned for the Brotherhood societies is called Guan Yu. So he is from the book Romance of the Three Kingdoms. He was like a 7 foot tall, a giant who had a red face, and he has a huge, I guess, halberd. And so it's just called a Guan Dao after him. So Guan, the General Guan's sword. And he had a horse, a magical horse. That's, I mean, obviously it's a mythological story, but that's how it's understood. So that is the deity that you will often see worshipped by Tongs or Triads. And interestingly, is that he is also the deity worshipped by policemen, especially in Hong Kong. But he will hold his halberd in the other hand. So when he's worshipped by police, he holds the halberd in his right hand, and when he's worshipped by the Triads, he holds his halberd in his left hand. So
Interesting.
so that plays a big role. You take brotherhood oaths, and because Romance of the Three Kingdoms is all about the brotherhood oaths, he's kind of like the perfect deity or the focal point for making oaths under. And so it's considered to be like very dishonorable. Like Chinese is an honor culture, so you do not dishonor your clan name. It's not as much honor based as Japanese, but there's a high degree of loyalty, and brotherhood is very emphasized, as well as in wuxia films, this idea of martial brotherhood, a kind of honor, which the boys do embody, especially when they take the magic drink in the elevator much later on. That is kind of a perfect wuxia moment, you could say. Like, it's like them recognizing each other as brothers, as sort of like in a triad in a way. So I would
And
say
it's kind of the moment in the film where they finally start listening to their own mystic, right? Because they got their own mystic wizard to fight Lo Pan, Egg Shen, and that's kind of the moment when they finally start listening to Egg Shen and finally drink his potion, right? It's like, at least for Kurt Russell's character Jack Burton, it seems to be the first time he's willing to listen to Egg Shen. He's very anti Egg Shen, right? He's opposed to all the mysticism and doesn't believe any of it, but then finally drinks the potion in the scene you're talking about. That definitely seems like it's got some sort of ritualistic undertones to it as well.
Well, JJ, it's interesting that you say that, because, in fact, during a Triad Brotherhood oath, you do drink a specific amount of Chinese rice wine, which is called baijiu, or maybe they add rooster blood to it, depending on the specific organization.
Rooster blood, huh?
There's
that sounds like quite a ritual.
That is also well,
rooster blood and rice wine. I mean, I'm familiar with soju. I've never drank a lot of soju in my life, the Korean rice wine. I don't know if I'd ever mix any rooster blood into it though.
Well, rooster blood is used to make magic sigils in Chinese, and this was a big part of Triad magic.
Interesting.
In the sort of Boxer Rebellion, is they would make these sigil sort of undershirts, like very kind of Mormon-like, but they would have writing on them.
I was going to say that, yeah.
And and so if the priest was powerful enough, it said that it would redirect bullets. So if you were shot at by a British musket, it would either, it gets exaggerated now, and people say, oh, they believe that the bullets would bounce off them. And that might have been true, but really, when you read the spells, it was about bullets avoiding them. So they would just be less likely to get shot. So very much in line with like any Seal of Solomon or any kind of sigil that they use in contemporary magic.
So is it fair to say then that the Chinese Freemasonry and the Triads are kind of the same thing, or is there just a crossover between these organizations? Is it some sort of tiered level? Like, you got to be a Freemason within Chinese Freemasonry to be a member of the Triads? Like, how does that work out?
So basically, anyone who became a successful businessman, and like a Chinese American or Chinese Canadian businessman, maybe up until now, even until at least they opened up mainland China, most people have a relationship with the benevolent societies. Now, does that mean that the benevolent societies are doing underground things? No, it doesn't. There's many clan societies and named like family name societies if you go into any Chinatown. However, they all have
underground. May I interject real quick, Jen? You do
Sure.
by underground things? Do you mean human trafficking and ritual human sacrifice in the undergrounds of Chinatowns, as depicted in the film Big Trouble in Little China?
Well, traditionally, the triad has been gun running, girl running, and drug running organization. That was their three primary focuses. But later on,
those are the staples of organized crime, right there. I mean, every organized crime unit, cult, mafia family, Tong family, Tong clan. I mean, it seems to be that's the staple, right? You deal in those three items, right?
No, you're absolutely right. And so, but one thing that the Tongs did do was they invested very heavily in both the Taiwanese, Japanese, and Hong Kong cinema of the 60s until the early 2000s. And they also,
so we're talking like Bruce Lee films then.
Basically, you cannot watch any Hong Kong film that's well known. Any Hong Kong film, it will basically be a triad money. But they actually were invested in making very high quality films. This was supposedly very important to them. So
the triad that Bruce Lee would have been intermingled with, and perhaps even involved in his death and whatnot, or at least ordering it or what have you. But these would be the same kind of triad that would have been operating in San Francisco, at that time here in America, right? So he's not dealing with just triad back there in Hong Kong. He's dealing with the contingent of, like, he's not getting away from them by coming to America, right? Like, he's dealing with those folks here in America then too, right?
Absolutely.
Like they work hand in hand, right?
And it's really interesting to note that we were talking a little pre-recording about the California politics and the triad. Well, the triads really were into building construction. I know this is a mafia stalwart as well, but a lot of the post-war construction in Taiwan was financed by the triads predominantly. And so it makes sense that you have certain places like San Gabriel Valley, SGV, and Long Beach that have a heavy Taiwanese American and triad Tong presence. So I think that the construction element, you cannot really get away from it. It's just that how deep do you want to dig? I think that's the sort of the answer to your question, JJ. It's like, are the Tongs, the benevolent societies, and the triads the same? Are Masonry and the triads the same? There's an interrelationship. And there's an interrelationship between temple societies. Like, there are specific temple organizations that run overseas Chinese temples. And so those also can be sort of groups, secret society groups of, obviously it could just be like Taoist priests, like shown in the movie with, when Egg Shen comes into the restaurant and they throw lots with bones. So it could just be like that, or it could be, it could be more. So I think you can make the case that there's always a little bit more, and maybe the sons of those men, like the sons of the more old-fashioned Chinese gentleman types, they dabbled in drugs, guns, girls, construction, and also film.
All the hood rat stuff, right? Like, this is the general hood rat stuff. Yeah, I think it is interesting, these stories of these Tongs. I mean, the kind of the history they captured in the plotline of this film is intriguing, but it's also intriguing to see that some of these this in large part, these political factions, these Tong units, these Chinese Americans who have settled in these cities long ago, have long been installed in the political system, or have been running the political system in their own neighborhoods, like little Chinatown in San Francisco, or, as you pointed out, the oldest one there in British Columbia, or even Seattle. I've never been to Portland's, but I know Seattle and definitely San Francisco have some big, you can tell when you're in Chinatown, right? It's not, you don't look around and it's not by accident. You're like, I'm in Chinatown. I mean, you look like you're in China, right? With all the architecture, all the shops and the businesses. And you can tell that, you almost get a feel that there's a different way of life in that neighborhood, right? It's almost like, I don't know, I kind of equate it to, like, I spent a year in South Korea as in the Air Force, one of my assignments, and I got to see a lot of the countryside of South Korea. I played was captain of my base soccer team, so we played all the other bases, stuff like that. Actually, one point in time, we myself and a few fellow garbage can dudes invaded the beach town of Busan, South Korea. I was shocked to find a beach town in South Korea full of Canadians. I didn't see it coming. All these British Columbia folks were all vacationing down in South Korea. Apparently, that was a common thing. But you go into these towns like Busan, for example. Like, I'm pretty sure we upset the local Korean mafia. Like, they were like watching us the entire week we were there. Like, we were up to so many shenanigans in that town that they didn't approve of. So you kind of get a feel. Like, I kind of get that same feel. Like, there's some folks, like some organized crime almost running this place. I'm not passing judgment on it. Because oftentimes, for example, Busan, South Korea, great beach town. I really enjoyed my visit. So if it's organized crime of some regard running that, good work for them. But you know what I mean? Like, you kind of get that feel, at least I have, in going into Chinatown and, for example, in San Francisco. Like, it's a different way of life, though. You can almost feel like there's a different system at play. Like there's a different rules for some of these folks that live there. And I presume it's the structure of this Tong system and the triads, like you've discussed, and the crossover of all these different organizations within the Chinese American communities that again still very relevant today.
Absolutely. And you can even see now, this has obviously changed since China has opened, like mainland China, and you've seen
early 1970s, like what we talk, like circa 74.
I would even say maybe 2010, like much. Like, you've seen especially Canada, you've seen an incredible amount of Mandarin speakers. Chinatown used to be predominantly Cantonese speaking. Maybe you have some, as I mentioned, like Hakka, Teochew, Hokkien minority speakers, but in general, Cantonese was the lingua franca. But now you can go into any Chinatown and it's almost everyone will speak Mandarin as either a second or primary language. So it has changed. It has changed the demographics and it's changed the sort of composition. It used to be very like, Cantonese people love a free market. They love, which can be very triad coded, I guess. But they love a free market and they love trading. It's called mai. So that's often when you ask Chinese people what they'll do, they'll say, oh, I mai here and there, meaning I buy and sell. So that's what it means, but it also can refer to trading. So it's interesting also to tie into the film, the Wing Kong Trading Company. And so that is very mai. That's very
that's the cover, right? That's Lo Pan's cover operation, right?
Right. And so another favorite triad activity is underground gambling. Chinese love to gamble. It's like mahjong, but also illegal casinos. That's a very triad activity.
Sure.
Very Chinese activity.
Sure. That's a great point, because I've never been to I've been to a lot of casinos, a lot of Vegas casinos, some of which I'm not allowed back in. That's a different tale altogether, though. But there's not a Vegas casino that I haven't seen the pie gow table filled of Chinese folks playing some pie gow. They love that. There's definitely a strong. I feel like there's more of an accepted culture for some of those activities in the Chinese culture versus the American culture. I could be mistaken, but
no, you're right. It's not unless you're a convert, like a Christian convert. It's not a direct sin.
Sure. That makes sense. That would be more popular like that. I mean, I feel like they love pie gow like Catholics love poker on Saturdays. At least around the Midwest, you find a lot of poker tournaments and Catholic churches. I'm like, doesn't this contradict what you guys are saying on Sundays? What you're doing on Saturdays? But whatever they want to do, I guess they run this place. But so that's interesting. So Lo Pan's running a kind of a common kind of triad front operation with the importing exporting situation. The film starts off, of course, with the character Jack Burton going to meet his buddy Wang Chi at the local legal gambling operation in an alleyway there in Chinatown. It's a great start of the film.
So in the 1980s, this might actually have been much more common. I think it was like Chinatown was much more of the Wild West, if you want to use that metaphor. I think that there was a spirit maybe of more gray market, if not explicitly black market activities. And I think that Wang Chi actually, in some ways he might be the main character, but he's also sort of more American, maybe even than Jack, just simply because he is like he owns a restaurant. He's like trying to
Yeah.
he came up from
He's
nothing.
living the American dream. Yeah, for sure.
Absolutely. And so he really
he flies in his green-eyed fiance from China, and she gets
that's
kidnapped by the Tong unit, or one of the triads, right? One of the Tongs. Who kidnaps her at the beginning of the film?
So it is the triad that's connected to Lopan and the Wing Kong exchange. However, I just want to point out that this movie, and I am also mixed, so maybe this is a plot point that only I find interesting, but there you can see how, well, she's mixed. Okay, so she's a Hong Kong actress. So Chinese people really don't come with green eyes. It's not does not really exist.
Right.
And so
I figured that might have some deeper meanings to the film, because I didn't feel like that was accurate as far as an accurate portrayal.
Well, I think it does actually speak to this idea of the Hong Kong Eurasian and how long they've actually been around. So they've been around since the 1650s. It was like a very common thing to have what they would call boat wives, is what they used to call the British would call the Cantonese or Tonka women, which is another sub-ethnicity.
Interesting. Okay.
But the Hong Kong, especially Hong Kong Eurasians, but this is not just true for Hong Kong. This is also true for Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, and Indonesia. That these mixed race people formed their own kind of ethnicity and culture, and then became, I would say, secondary elites, second only to Europeans in these colony countries, right? So the fact that she has green eyes is very syncretic in a way. It's very synthesis. It's very like it's very east meets west in the most literal of ways.
Sure.
So that's
it definitely kind of ties in, like you were saying, to that Wang Chi's living the American dream with he's got his own restaurant. You know, he's starting to forge his own future, which they discussed that as part of the plot line, how some of the indentured slaves and of what that are going on there in Chinatown, whether it be indentured sex slaves or indentured labor slaves.
So this is a big part of the early Cantonese history, is this idea of indentured servitude, and all those boys who worked on the railroads, for the most part, were actually indentured servants. So not necessarily like to the great white slave master, I'm not saying that, but they were indentured to maybe other Chinese people, other triads, other maybe local bosses who were building contracting from the U.S. government. So this idea is really interesting, and they didn't also allow women to immigrate here unless they didn't allow wives, excuse me. So they only could bring in girls who were going to work as laundresses, quote unquote. And so often,
sure.
So
that's the cover story, right?
Exactly.
She does the laundry.
So they weren't allowed.
They all do the laundry.
Exactly. So they weren't allowed to bring their wives, and so they brought over all these girls to the brothels, and so that's really the first time some of these workmen had seen women in like maybe a decade or so. So
interesting. So what era are we talking? This is kind of the not the end of the Old West, but kind of the post, almost the end of the Old West, right? This kind of time frame we're talking.
Yeah, so like right in the 1850s, maybe at the end, they started relaxing some of the immigration restrictions to bring over more, more families, more married couples, more women that were not just tied to these laundries. It became more of like the men would actually, if they were able to sort of liberate themselves, they could send money back home, which was the whole idea of them being out here in the first place, and then they would bring their families with them. So again, very much like Wang Chi and what he's doing with the restaurant to like sort of bring over more people and to sort of start their life there.
Nice. Yeah, it definitely seems to be a lot of history written into this movie that just on its face, this is a very exciting film, but I think I'm even more intrigued learning some of the historical stuff put into this film, especially when you start getting into some of the mystical elements. So they kidnap the young green-eyed girl, the Hong Kong girl of Wang Chi's fiance, and they're going to sacrifice her, right, for some sort of ritual so that old Lopan here can become a human again. But Lopan's got all sorts of wizardry going on.
Mhm.
In fact, he's got some elemental dudes that work for him. What are
Mhm.
those guys about? The guy that's shooting the lightning out of his hands, and Nick knows what I'm talking about, like the Raiden Mortal Kombat type of fella.
Yep. So thunder, rain, and lightning. So
Nice.
they're kind of the embodiment of the, you could say, temple protectors, or just like immortals who have like culminated. They're just magicians basically that have cultivated themselves with Taoist alchemy and with Taoist sorcery, and then they are able to produce sort of elemental effects, we'll say. So all of their magic really is just a result. That's what's interesting about Chinese magic, is that it's all like, you just start out from level 0. You're just like an RPG character sort of starting out, and then you level up. And so, and then you're leveling up, you eventually sort of reach, I guess, apotheosis, and you're not immortal, but you're immortal maybe that your life, like Lopan, is just like greatly, it's like thousands of years rather than like 100 years, but you still can die. But Lopan obviously can't die because he's what is called Zhongguai, which is half ghost, half god. So they don't.
He kind of resides in like a liminal space, right?
Yes, exactly. So
Jin,
sorry, JJ.
Jin, can I just ask you something really quick? You've mentioned it a few
Bud.
times. How do you say it? Lopan? How is that spelled?
Lopan.
That's interesting. And that's like that's like not made up.
No, that's a real name. It can mean big brother, as in like triad term, not actual big brother as in like your familial relation, but like a triad brother or big boss is another way to understand that. And it can also refer to the deity Lopan.
Just every time you say it, it makes me think of Eopan in the Star Room.
Oh. What's that? What's Eopan?
It's one of the few rituals Crowley actually wrote. You'll repeat Eopan in the middle of the ritual, basically.
I wonder if he was deep into Buddhist stuff. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if he entered in some Taoist principles into some of his studies, right? So maybe he encountered Lopan and some of his stuff and incorporated some of that into his, because he kind of pieced together things from various philosophies, right? So I mean, that kind of goes in line with what he did, right?
Absolutely.
It's interesting. I've never heard of this Eopan, but that's certainly something I'm going to look more into. I appreciate that, Nick. That's
yeah. As you're saying it, you even go like this too.
Interesting.
Eopan.
Lopan's one of the greatest. He's one of my favorite '80s villains for sure. There's some good '80s villains, but Lopan kills it. Yeah, I've always kind of wondered some of those elemental factors. It just seems like must have some deeper meaning with some of that wizardry going on there relative to Lopan.
Well, it's interesting you say this, JJ, because when Uncle, I forget his name, I'm having a moment, but the uncle in
Egg or Egg Shen, I mean.
But then he's also with the uncle, Wang Chi's uncle in the restaurant.
Oh yeah, that's right.
And he says like thunder, rain and thunder at the beginning. This is a I Ching thing. Yeah, I think it comes from the 21st trigram. It means it's like troublesome at the beginning or obstacles at the beginning. So this is what the thunder, rain, and lightning are referring to, these sort of ferocious sky gods in Taoist cosmology, and maybe primordial elemental gods. In one way, you could say that. We'll get more into this when we talk about the cosmology around Lopan, but you could say that these are his sort of like, if Lopan is like the great sort of sorcerer king of Chinatown, these are his like deities, sub-deities, you could say, or retinue figures that are with him that he sends out on mission. So definitely all three powers are very closely associated with dragons. These, in Chinese cosmology, dragons are not associated with fire. They are associated with two elements predominantly, which is sky and water. So you can see this kind of mirrors that. And then also when they're at the Wing Kong Trading Company, it is very representative of a Buddhist underworld. And when they're in the elevator, he even says this is not Chinese counting backwards. This is Chinese counting downwards. Well, this is a really interesting point because Chinese actually can be read upwards, downwards, left to right, and right to left. So it is often considered a dragon language because it's very flexible.
Interesting.
And so yeah, so I in my opinion, they would represent sort of this draconic draconic forces, elemental primordial forces that, you know, they don't have that much build out of their characters in the film, but they serve their purpose, their role.
Interesting. Okay. Well, and it's a pretty legendary scene in the film here when the protagonist here, Wang Chi's not there in the initial. Well, no, I guess he is. Wang Chi's with him. Wang Chi and Jack Burton here encounter these elemental characters, kind of overlording along with Lopan, overlording over these different Tong wars that are going on. These fighting factions of different Tong groups, and you know, it's where they establish kind of the legendary nature of Lopan, because, you know, they discuss after the encounter, after they escaped the encounter, Burton and Wang Chi there, they escaped the encounter with these mystical wizard folks, and no one wants to believe that they actually encountered Lopan. No one, he kind of exists as a notion as opposed to a person, right? Like, he's not like really known like to anyone encountering. So he almost seems like he's playing this puppet master role of all these Tong groups, and, you know, because they could literally wipe out an entire group there in that scene, right? Like, they just murk an entire Tong group there in that scene.
So you have the Chang Sings, who are the guys with the gold and the black. So that's also interesting. I'm sure Nick is like, it's the association of the black and the gold. That is obviously has a very Saturnian association in general. But interestingly, when I was prepping for this show, I had to look at there's a grouping of deities that are the most primordial of Chinese religion, you could say, and they are the 5 emperors, so the Wu Shen. So five king gods, you could say. They're the expression of heaven. So, but heaven's one, but then they take they become a dyad, or not a pentad, excuse me. So
There's 5 of them.
There's 5 of them, and the deity that's associated with the center. So China is considered to be a center kingdom, Zhongguo, which means central kingdom. That's what China always has thought of itself as, the center of the world. The center is considered to be Saturnian. So that emperor, that yellow emperor, he is associated with the center. So, and then you have the other group, the other Tong group, who wears the black and red. So that's obviously more martial. It's associated with the Western direction in the Chinese cosmology and the god of fire. So the yellow emperor is considered to, or excuse me, it's the southern deity, who is interestingly the god who gave Chinese medicine, building, architecture, agriculture. So it's like the Promethean figure who has given Chinese people their culture, basically. So
yeah, is this like the light bearer, the great, you know, is that what you're saying as far as within the Chinese culture?
Well, it's interesting. He's considered to be he's red, so he's a giant, and he's like, I don't know, like 9 feet tall. He has bull horns, and he is kind of the, I guess, light bearer in some ways, in that he gives the knowledge to the yellow people. So the yellow people are yet represented by the yellow emperor, but is the red emperor who gives them like the knowledge of civilization, where the yellow emperor, which is obviously represented by Saturn, he gives them the knowledge of writing and the knowledge of sort of cultivated arts, we'll say.
Interesting. Is there a green emperor? Because as you're describing these characteristics, sounds a lot like Lo Pan. I mean, what was Lo Pan, like 12 feet tall or something like that? Is supposed to be in the film?
Well, it's interesting you say this, because his demon, and so Lopan even says this, my demon that I have to appease, but he's not saying demon in the Western esoteric sense. He's actually meaning in the Chinese way, which is just the deity that he's pissed off. So it becomes his adversarial figure, his Satan, if you will. It becomes his cursing deity. So that is Qing Dai. Qing Dai is the god of the East. He is the god, the blue-green, because it's always blue-green. He's considered to be the blue-green emperor of the East, associated with Jupiter. So that is who has cursed Lopan with the curse of formlessness. So that's really interesting. And the emperor, the Qin dynasty emperor, has cursed him with the curse of feelinglessness. So like no sensation.
Sure. No, I think that's very interesting. I appreciate you breaking some of that down. That's some fascinating stuff there, Jen. So as they're encountering, as they first then are encountering in the film, kind of the next chronological events that they encounter, that I at least seems that there may be some more to the esoteric or occult understanding of whatever the hell this character really fits in the film, because it doesn't make a lot of sense. And that's the kind of the Bigfoot character, the guy that lives in the sewer, the big kind of, like it looks kind of like some sort of sewer Bigfoot. And he kidnaps the girl at one point as they're trying to escape. He plays some sort of like I don't know, some sort of pawn role to Lopan. Lopan directs him in some way, it seems.
Well, it seems like Lopan, you could say, is kind of the Lord of Hosts. I think that would be kind of a fair explanation. Like maybe not the heavenly host, but certainly a kind of chthonic, as you're saying, sewer dwelling, hell beast host.
Sure.
So I think that goes along with the idea that, right, he's half ghost, half god, and that's in the cosmology is that he dwells within both. Like he's sort of a man, but he's sort of not a man. He's sort of a deity, but he's sort of not a deity, and he's sort of a ghost, but he's also not. He's like a little bit higher than a ghost. So there is a deity actually that in Chinese cosmology that fits this archetype, who's called Zhongguai, which is literally means half ghost, half god. So that's quite interesting. And what else do we have? Okay, so
you're telling me sewer Bigfoot's a real thing?
Well, I think the idea is more that there's a secret world under Chinatown that is also connected to Chinese cosmology.
Right, that they did leave it as a cliffhanger with that monster with sewer Bigfoot.
But in the comic book series, they did actually resolve it. He becomes like sort of a foil / pet.
He becomes Jack Burton's pet because he does. He hitches a ride there on the Pork Chop Express.
That's right. So he kind of becomes like, if anything, I would say he's like a gremlin, or like if people are familiar with Japanese mythology, there's the idea of the yokai. Well, the idea of the yokai, which are just like spirits that surround us in our daily lives, that actually comes from China, as like with most things Japanese. and so they so that I would say he's like a mountain ogre or a mountain goblin. And that exists obviously in the Chinese cosmology, but they're chthonic, where you could say Lopan and the three thunders, we'll call them, earth, lightning, rain, and thunder. They are the mountain deities. And so below them, this is a very Chinese cosmological concept, right? The central pillar, the middle axis, that's what Lopan would represent. So the mountain king. And so everything below him is kind of like his servant or his serf.
So, like in kind of Western theology or philosophies relative to demons and mysticism and whatnot, he's kind of like a demigod, right? Like Lopan, he's kind of he's got godlike powers, but he's clearly not God.
So the Chinese cosmology has many expressions of deities, we'll say. Like there are people who can become immortals, as I said, which is called a shen. So this idea that you can cultivate yourself, be born a human, cultivate yourself with internal and external alchemy, basically magic and martial arts, if you want to use a shorthand version. And so then they can they can eventually become immortal. So he is like a demigod. I guess that's the closest kind of comparison that you could have, but you could also say he's a fairy. That is a very common translation for his like cosmological position. You could also say he is a god, because Chinese have a lot of deified, obviously Lopan, and deified people. So people who became deified later on by certain ethnic groups or certain secret societies. So you could also say he fills that role as well.
Interesting. Okay. Nick, do you looks like you picked up on a couple things that Jen was saying there. Did you have any thoughts on some of the symbolism that we were discussing there?
No, to be honest, I mean, it was just interesting because I don't know much about like the stuff that Jin gets into. So yeah, yeah, and I was just like listening, and there was just certain things. You know, there was something I did want to ask you, but this goes like way back. And I didn't want to get off track, but it is something I did want to ask you, Jin. When it comes to maybe not so much. I mean, obviously, maybe you'd know more about this, but I'm not saying particularly like Asian gangs, but gangs in general. Do you ever think that like some of them are actually being run by like occultists, or it is kind of set up like a secret society in a sense?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think you and JJ have laid the groundwork for my conclusion on this, and I think JJ also knows when we've podcasted before that I think this is that I really think that things like a gang or even like Crips and Bloods, I mean, that clearly has very occult, not only origins but like connections to higher.
Oh, for sure. And they use some occult symbolisms. I don't mean to step on you, Jim, but yeah, you're spot on target there, bud. They use something I learned looking at some visiting some smiley face killer spots in and around the Ohio region, specifically some of the urban areas. I noticed a lot of the occult symbols that are used by the Bloods and the Crips and tagging things. I was like, oh, that's interesting. I didn't know they used pentagrams and star configurations.
I think one thing that would set a Chinese organization, there's actually a great Indonesian film that is about this exact question about how sort of Chinese triad in Jakarta is run by wizards, like Taoist wizards. And so the guy has to escape from them. The movie's not magical per se. It's a martial arts film, like extremely bloody, but it has the element of like this idea, even with Bruce Lee, like when JJ, you were bringing up Bruce Lee, like my grandparents sincerely believe that Bruce Lee died of a Taoist curse. Like this is like they're legit. If you were to ask them, they would say that that's true. So I think that all of these societies, just like the Western societies, they have what we'll call the secret chiefs, who are sort of people who exist and go between the higher orders and the outer temple orders. So I think that that's absolutely true. But I think that the Chinese tend to be more insular, and they don't value necessarily following as much. Like the Yakuza is very different than the Triad. The Triad would be more, you can sort of be your own man. There's something more American about it, where the Yakuza is like you must follow the head guy no matter what.
Sure. Yeah, they seem to be much more on that elder worship within the Japanese. So yeah, I could see the Yakuza adapting to that as well. Yeah. Now, those are some great points. I don't, on that note, I don't view politics, and we can call it wizardry or sorcery or occultism or whatever you want to call it. I like to call it, just joking around, I call it wizardry or sorcery, but I don't view these things as separate, right? Like they're the same thing to me, even in American politics. You know, for example, I like to pick on the man because there's good reason to. John Podesta, you know, in the infamous Podesta emails, they were released by WikiLeaks. The man who is out of prison, but no one really knows where he's at, Julian Assange. Yeah, he's waiting in the wings, I'm sure, to tell that story at some point. But the Podesta emails, one of the things that really stood out to me when I read through them the first couple times, you know, I was really fascinated by those things. You know, I was really on a back at that time. I far different understanding of world politics and parapolitics than I do today, but an eye-opening aspect of those emails was the use of the term thelemic favor. You know, quote unquote thelemic favor. The Yale librarian wrote John Podesta an email for asking for a private one-on-one meeting with then President, some folks call him Barack Obama, Barry Soetoro, and that favor was, you know, the one-on-one meeting, the quote unquote thelemic favor. I don't think, you know, in my opinion, you can't be asking someone for a thelemic favor unless there's context for that verbiage being used, thelemic favor, and in which case, I mean, you're screaming you're Thelemite, in my opinion, at that point, because you're using that as common, you know, in some sort of common understood language between the parties. And again, it's an important thing, so it's making it seem like providing a context. This is used in a very, you know, important. You know, they're not using that in a derogatory sense. It's not slang or anything else like that for a derogatory meaning. It's an important meaning. So I look at things like that, and then on the topic of old Barack Obama / Barry Soetoro, Well, Barry, his father. A lot of folks think he's from Africa. I am of a different opinion. He seems to be the son of a mystic, mystic leader of a sex cult, Islamic sex cult out of Indonesia, the Subud cult. So I often view, and if that's true, then there's a prime epicenter of activity between Thalamites, Subud, this mystic Islamic cult leader's son, became the president of the United States, right? Whose right hand man, John Podesta, who was the senior advisor at the time. That's why he's getting an email asking for a Thalamic favor. So if my assumptions are correct based upon those kind of circumstantial events and facts, it seems like we have an epicenter, even in American politics, of this occult wizardry and what we call politics. And I don't think that's any different in any culture, and it's certainly not different in the film Big Trouble in Little China. That's exactly what's going on in Little China. The folks running is Lo Pan and the wizards.
Well, let me just respond in two parts, JJ. So first of all, the Manchu religion that I sort of laid out at the very beginning with it that was existent at the Qing dynasty period is not Taoist or Buddhist, but it has both of those elements. And so the five emperor system, that kind of pentad of deities that I was referring to, with Lo Pan having the demon of Jupiter, or the god of Jupiter be his demon, that actually comes from Manchurian Tengriism. So this kind of, I guess people call it Tartarian, but I'm not using it in that.
Tartarians.
Right.
That's a hot topic these days.
Right. So they were Tengrius from Central Asia. And so they have a thing called the banner system. So there's 5 banner colors that relate to each of the 5 emperors. Okay. But their religion, basically every government that they set up in China had a bureau of astrology, had a bureau of magical state rituals, had a bureau of exorcism, had a bureau of magical rites. This existed well into the 1750s. And even Xi Jinping's wife now, everybody knows that I practice Vajrayana. His wife also is quite a famous Vajrayana practitioner. And so she hosted the World Buddhist Conference, and Xi Jinping also has substantial Manchurian ethnicity. So I would posit that there is a kind of shamanistic, Tengriistic, or magical sort of backdrop to Chinese politics in general, and that most people will understand a film that is a wuxia film as having magical elements innately.
Okay, so that's a common characteristic of the genre then. So that's necessary to be a wuxia film.
It must have at least some kind of reference to Taoist or magical cultivation. And then obviously, because I said this is a Cantonese film, that is also why Lo Pan says that Egg Shen practices village magic. So during the Boxer Rebellion, there was a distinguishment between what is called Maoshan magic, which is more the Cantonese, Southern Chinese village magic, Taoism and Buddhism mixed together, and this kind of Northern Chinese shamanism. And if people are familiar with the Temple of Heaven, which is very famous in Beijing, Beijing was the northern capital. It's one of the northernmost sort of cities of where ethnic Chinese live. And so that temple is not Buddhist or Taoist. It's actually a shamanistic Tengri temple. So that's very interesting. Star worshippers. So I think
that predates the Buddhism and the Taoism.
Well, now we're getting into hot territory, JJ, because
I figured as much.
There's an idea that Taoism is novel Buddhism. So this is an idea of the later
Buddhism. I'm familiar with that concept. Like Buddhism came and then someone readapted some of the practices under the Tao Te Ching, right?
So you could even, I think some of the Buddhist scholars thought of Taoism as sort of a proto-Dharma or a proto-Buddhism that already existed in China. And then when you look at the Taoists, this is very interesting, is that when they were traveling, so there's a book of I guess it's not a book, but it's sort of like a genre of literature called the Tang Travel Journals. So it talks about these different sages who went all around the Chinese borderlands, and they went up into Siberia, and they looked at what the Tengriist or Siberian shamans were practicing, and they actually said that it was a native Taoism. They actually called it Xia. Mun. So that's very interesting. It means the underworld gate, under the gate. So they kind of saw it all as existing, like all related. So the cosmology is all very interrelated. And then the Buddhists obviously preserved a lot of, China doesn't get enough credit, but it actually, in the early days especially, preserved Buddhism. I would say they probably promoted it the most with state-sponsored support. So you could say that all three religions play there. You can't really say one is more important, and you can't really say one. They're not really different either. They kind of all have a relationship.
Sure. Except for they kind of, at least, I mean, my understanding from some of my studies was the idea of Taoism was to kind of remove the God figure out of it, remove the Buddha from it, right?
So Taoism never really had, they pretty much just refer to the primordial Lord of Heaven, and then primordial Mu, or the primordial, like, I guess, wisdom goddess, like a Sophia sort of, but not really, maybe a Barbello grandmother, Gnostic grandmother kind of figure. She's like the wife of God of heaven. So, but then later Chinese cosmology really expands it out into this 5 emperor system, and then it becomes like many gods and many deities, and all the stars are deities. This was asterism worship was a major part of Chinese cosmology, and in planetary deities.
Is it standard cosmology? We talking about different kind of astrological worship? What are we talking about here as far as the Chinese? I mean, we're talking the same kind of, astrology that's accepted in the West, or is it a little bit different?
JJ, is because it sort of has gone so underground that, like, there are some scholars working on it right now, but a lot of people actually forgot, and a lot of people even forgot the planetary deity names of the older Chinese gods. So I actually am starting to see it as a little different. It's maybe more, I think that it's more Northern Asian, if I'm being honest with you. I think that it's very advanced. It's much more advanced than maybe even, the Egyptians always get all the credit for the star stuff. I actually think this is very advanced. They have many more constellations than we do. They have many more deities. They understand they're not just deities, because that is kind of like you were saying, this Taoist idea that there is kind of no God, but then they are also a God. So that's kind of the idea.
Right.
Non-dual way of looking at it. So they're not just gods. They kind of represent maybe elemental sort of phenomena in time, or certain concepts that only humans can understand. Like, they're very advanced is what I'm trying to say. It's high IQ. So I think it's different than the other systems, to be honest, is how I'm sort of seeing it. But this is just me with a cursory understanding of it, not as an astrologer.
I'm back.
Yeah, you're back. I can hear you.
No, nice. I'm back. All right. No, I was just saying, I think that, the Western philosophy seem to anthropomorphize a lot of these characters, and you make them human. So I feel like that's not something that the Eastern philosophies necessarily do. And I think that's a good way to put it, as elementals. Yeah. And I think that the Taoism, to me, just seemed like, removing kind of the human elements of it, because even the writer, right? Lao Tzu, is that right? Is that
Lao Tzu, yeah.
Yeah. He's not even a real person, right? Even it translates into kind of like the writer or something, right?
Well, yeah, it can be the old master. His name has different meanings. But no, you're right. I mean, he can be a real person. He can be a deified sort of character. But then, Chinese people are much more practical in their religious framework. They'll pray to a deity if it works. Like, if they hear it works, they'll pray. There's even a saying in Cantonese, like, have God will pray. It's just like, it's the idea that if your focus is a successful business, and you hear that this deity is for a successful business, and your neighbor does it, then you're going to do it too. That's kind of the idea.
Sure.
It's not really about a
brand. That has a very practical sense to it. That's a good way to put it. Yeah. So what else do you have left on our journey here throughout some of this esoteric or occult review of Big Trouble in Little China here, Jin? Well, been enjoying the conversation thus far. I just wanted to see where else you wanted to take us here on this journey, or what. I knew you had a couple other things you wanted to bring into the conversation.
Well, I think we should talk about Gracie Law or Kim Cattrall for just a minute,
Sure.
just because this is a big film for her, even though it wasn't like a huge commercial success, but she was more visible in this film than in maybe other things she had done before. And so I
Sure.
think it's interesting that they also cast her as maybe this is just me projecting, but I also assume she was Eurasian because her name's Gracie Law in the film. So she said, "This is my neighborhood." She makes it very pronounced. Yep. And so, and Lopan considers her someone that he can then marry and sacrifice. So a Chinese.
Good point. She does have a very important role in Lopan's eyes.
Right. So I would assume that maybe they just cast Kim Cattrall and they're kind of subtly saying that she's Eurasian. That's kind of the vibe I always thought when I watched this movie as a kid.
Because she's got the green eyes too, right? That's kind of the thing Lopan's looking for. He's all about them green eyes.
Yes. So I thought that was very interesting. And then also like Egg Shen, his name means like egg spirit or egg god. If you write out like the character for Shen, it means spirit or God. Usually it refers to a higher deity. But it's interesting because even the egg makes sense as one of the primordial Promethean figures in Chinese cosmology is a guy named Pangu. So Pangu is a giant who lives in an egg. And after thousands of years in the primordial chaos, he stands up to stretch out and he breaks the top of the egg. And all of chaos sort of pours out, and then he has to put it.
That's interesting.
Yeah,
because that's why I left that part in the preview with Egg Shen saying "order out of chaos." Not only that, I thought Nick might appreciate the Masonic elements of that phrase, but it's interesting you're breaking it down. So this Egg Shen is literally born out of this chaos.
Well, the primordial mother, she is seen as sort of like it's not, but again, like you said, JJ, it's not necessarily a figure. It's just the idea, pantheistic idea that the primordial chaos is feminine, like a yin, she's yin, whereas heaven or sort of the light illumination is yang or male. So I think this is also relevant in terms of, Lopan and his sort of religious rituals, because you see that the Wang Chi and Egg Shen have a kind of religious framework maybe, but they're not like devout, they don't have a devout religiosity. But you see Lopan, he has this whole altar set up in the sewers, and he has the deities all over the Wing Kong Trading Company, and in fact they even import
That's a good point. That's a very good point. Yeah, because when Wang Chi, he kind of immediately knows what's going on, right? He's like, but he can't break down the metaphysics of whatever Lopan's up to. That's when they bring in Egg Shen as the expert. But like, Wang Chi certainly is schooled in some of this esoteric knowledge.
Yes, and it's interesting because his uncle is also shown to be like a skilled diviner. Maybe you could even say a magician, and
that's right.
And then you could say Egg Shen is kind of the rebel magician. In some ways, that's even how the film sort of subtly implies, where he's like a rebel magician going up against a secret society, because that's how I read the film. I mean, right? He's going up against this kind of Masonic deity figure, and he has to kind of topple him. And he lives a quite modest life, but as Wang Chi says, he's a very rich man. So
he kind of lives in a liminal space himself, doesn't he?
Yes.
I mean, he's presented as this man who's like driving a bus tour, but then he's also kind of a mystical being.
100%. He's obviously, it's implied that he's been alive for at least 1,000 years.
Right.
That he's been Wang Chi's like thorn in his side, or not Wang Chi, excuse me, Lopan's thorn in his side, I think is how it's phrased. And I think that. So they've clearly had a long interrelationship, and Chinatowns also are a very liminal space. You often pass a gate, you pass through a threshold before you go into Chinatown. So
very, very international waters type environment, a lot of trading going on, fish, goods, services, hookers, you name it, you can get it all in Chinatown. So at least that's what Jack Nicholson said in his film Chinatown. No, I think that's a great point, Nick. This order out of chaos thing, I was saying that I put that in the introduction for the portion from the trailer where Egg Shen is saying order out of chaos, basically screaming it, which I think is, again, it's very interesting what Jen explained. That's a great explanation, Jen. Appreciate that.
Thank you.
The esoteric understanding. It's clearly got a deeper meaning with this, with the name of Shen and the probably even the, I don't remember the exact scene there on the bus when they're screaming that, but when he's the scene that comes from. But clearly that's a very common Masonic phrase, right, Nick? That's the order out of chaos.
Yeah, or just that's just very occult in itself.
Very magician. Is that common within magician's code?
Yeah, for sure.
It was kind of a Crowley thing too, right? He was all about kind of order out of chaos and his sex magic.
Yeah, I would say that's not a term that's like not heard in the magical community.
Very common phrase, huh?
Yeah.
I would actually maybe even make an argument. This might not be true, and I'm sure that I'll get a telemite in my DM saying that I'm wrong, which is. But I would argue that perhaps Crowley borrowed this phrase from the I Ching, because it's
nice.
a prominent idea with the trigrams. So this is different than the hexagrams, but the trigrams, because the unbroken line in a trigram, that is considered order, and the broken trigram with a split in the middle, that is considered chaos. So there's a feminine and a masculine element, a receptive and generative force right in the trigram itself. So I mean, it's a very important concept for learning I Ching, and just reading the Tao Te Ching, like the just the novel book, that people read as sort of magical learning, I guess. The idea is in the first chapter. It says to bring order out of chaos, the primordial female, the primordial male, So I mean, it's, I would say, foundational basis in Chinese cosmology, at least it speaks to either there's a perennial system, which is my thesis, or it's Crowley borrowed it in.
All right, fair enough. So this is it almost like a yin and a yang relationship then between Lo Pan and Egg Shen?
So this is really
existing for thousands of years together. They're the force of light and dark versus one another.
Well, it is interesting because Egg Shen seems to know a lot about the underworlds, rather than being he's not like a normative hero. He's not like a sword wielding hero. He's a magician, right? Like he's a sorcerer, specifically
kind of an anti-hero.
Exactly. And so I would say that whereas Lo Pan is physically yin, meaning physically without a body, a corporeal form.
Right.
Shen is very much like the yang. He is very much the corporeal sorcerer who's gone to fight this great demon or great ghost, who is also, maybe you could say, not his brother, but maybe they trained under the same master. I think there's a little bit of an implication in one of my favorite scenes where they do the fighting with the gems and they do a mental projection, and you see the two fighters appear.
Right.
And even the colors are very significant, the emerald and this kind of pink, fuchsia, purple. And so those are colors that would be produced in synthesis. And I think the emerald, obviously emerald tablets, emerald will, which you can also contrast against the idea of the jade green eyes, because jade is opaque, you cannot pass light through, and it is also self-luminous, meaning that it kind of produces its own light. And jade is considered to be a living force, so you can't really project light through it, but Lo Pan projects light through this emerald. Egg Shen projects light through this amethyst. Again, there's a Saturnian and Mercurial or Jupiterian, because Chinese people think of Jupiter more as green than blue, but Qing can mean both. That's what's interesting about it. It can mean both blue and green. So I don't know if I went off too much tangent.
No, it's great. Yeah, I mean, you brought up something I was thinking before, and I saw a comment in the chat earlier regarding the jade theme here in the film. And I think there's a very strong, a very overt the theme of this very green or jade, theme that goes on throughout various aspects of the film. Yeah, it's interesting.
Twin Peaks does that with their table. Yeah, the table that they show a lot of times that the ring's on in the weird room or the Red Lodge or whatever you call it. It's always either green or blue.
Yeah. Yeah,
Well,
I don't know enough about that Twin Peaks, but what I do know, it seems like it's very steeped in occultism.
oh yeah,
Mhm.
for
Mhm.
sure.
Yeah.
You can always tell a magician by how much he loves Twin Peaks, or they love. Twin
Okay.
Peaks.
That's a metric, huh? The Twin Peaks metric.
Yeah.
Nice. Well, so the idea that there's this deity then of Lopan who can embody do this human sacrifice and take over a human body again, right? Essentially come back to be a living human again. This is very common within some of the occultism in the Chinese culture, or is this some sort of like almost ritual ceremonial magic idea? Because again, I feel like this. I recognize there are human ritual sacrifices in our modern era. I talk about the smiley face killers a lot in that regard, but I think that's just one example. And I often wonder, whatever twisted mindset some of these cults have, do they actually think that they're trying? This seems like a concept that I actually think that some of these groups might maintain, this idea that they're committing these ritual human sacrifices in which to bring the spirit of some god they worship into the the earthly region, or earthly body, or environment.
Well, this is a great point, JJ. So I think that, so to answer your first question, I think the idea of bringing him into form is a Buddhist one. He's like a ghost god, we'll call him, or they call him a spirit medium powers. So like a spirit medium who has maybe they can sort of, instead of invoking a spirit into them, they can invoke a human into them, meaning that he can sort of take the form as the little guy in the wheelchair. So I think that is more of a Buddhist idea. He's trying to become part of the pleasure realm, or the Kama Rupa, the sort of the realm of where you can feel sense pleasures, right? And so,
Sure.
but then I think it's the opposite for, like, I think you're right. So Wang Chi even says this. He says this has to do, when Jack's asking like what's going on, Wang Chi goes, this has to do with like folk tales and legends, like
Right. He doesn't
white
even try to explain it to Jack. He's just trying, like, she's like telling Jack, "You're not ever going to understand this."
100%. So this is exactly the scene I'm referring to. And Wang Chi goes, it has to do with like white ape sacrifice. He lists off like a few things, and white ape sacrifice is one of them. So this is a really interesting idea, and you can see this in a lot of the Buddhist scholarship of like right now, and just maybe the later last 50 years. But they were talking about this sort of like the origin of certain myths of origination myths. So the Tibetans believe that they are the descendants of a earth ogress, so a mount, like a earth demon, you could say, and a red ape. And Chinese people believe that they are the sort of their ancestor is a white ape and a mountain goddess, but not like an ogress, like a fairy or something. Okay, so so a lot of times in tantric and Taoist magic, it's more sympathetic than it is blood. Like there, yes, of course, there can be a component of animal or even other kinds of sacrifice, but really you're talking about like an effigy or something as a stand-in. So, but originally they would their stand-in were white apes instead of instead of sacrificing people. So this is actually speaking to like a real thing that used to really happen, and also maybe gave way to the myth of Sun Wukong, which is obviously a part of my Twitter handle, which is the Monkey King. So his myth partly comes out of this deified white ape, both sacrifice and worship. So definitely there is an element of this historically, but then there have been many murders in Asia and Southeast Asia that do have a ritual component. So clearly you could just think of it as very transactional, maybe not even parapolitical, just like, oh, I have to kill this person anyway, so I might as well just do it in the name of whatever. So then they do that. So that is true. And definitely there's a thing in Indonesia, since you brought up Barry, our good friend. There are things called ninja murders. So this was very popular in the 90s and the 80s and the 90s, where they would sort of hunt down magicians or or dukuns or shamans, and then the men in the village would all dress in these black kind of ninja outfits, I guess, and they would go chop people up, basically that were suspected of practicing sorcery or magic.
That's
so
wild.
I definitely think it's real. Like there's an element of like human sacrifice that's very palpable, I guess, about the whole thing, and clearly you can see that he has to appease the god, and I'm saying the god of Jupiter. So that's also really interesting from a metaphysical perspective, because usually in Western esotericism we consider the like a Jupiterian deity to be more benevolent, especially in like more of the Christian ideas of not Jupiter as a god, but Jupiter as sort of a archetype. That would be like more of an association with Jesus and like mercy and loving kindness, like all this idea associated with that. So we would consider like that would not be human sacrifice with that, but maybe in a Chinese idea, you have to have the blood offering to appease the god. So it doesn't really matter how it's derived, you're just doing it to do it. So it's much more functionary. So you could say it's rather than, so maybe a Western magician would say, oh, I'm going to do this to gain all the power of the world. But a Chinese magician would think of it more like, I have to do this because it's like, it's mandated by heaven. So it's more
right. So the world keeps moving, right?
Right, exactly.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's an interesting way to look at the two different variations of the Eastern versus Western philosophies of the occultism.
Yeah. I would even say you see that even going down like to like Mexico and those other countries. I would even think a lot of them, it seems like their sacrificing was because it needed to be done.
Right. Which we're going to be talking about similar. That was a good plug there, Nick, and I think it was an inadvertent one, but we're going to be talking about a show next week, kind of a continuation here, myself and Nick, regarding human sacrifice on a very circumstance such as that. The Mississippian mound culture that is throughout the South and throughout much of the Mississippi Valley. Those mounds are built in a kind of Mesoamerican style temples that are seen down there in stone, but these are made out of earthen materials. But we're going to be talking about this next Wednesday is a murders that occurred on one of those mound sites. What I assert is a ritual human sacrifice by a ancient alien cargo cult that we've previously discussed on the Occult Rejects, the New Wabian Nation, and the formerly of the city of Tamaray down in rural Georgia, the ancient Egyptian pyramid with a nightclub, or a pyramid complete with its own nightclub inside the pyramid, built on a mound in a very elaborate structure that's since been destroyed because their cult leader was sent away for very aggressive kid diddling and sex trafficking charges. And their financier, the Hollywood actor Wesley Snipes, went to prison under the same time, but he went under the Al Capone prosecution for tax evasion. But yeah, we're going to be talking about that next week regarding some human sacrifice on a very Mesoamerican style human sacrifice that I think that went on along these kind of sites. But I think the groups are like the New Wabian Nation, perhaps members of the New Wabian Nation, that is, were using this site as much like other groups, I think, do use these mound sites for the ritual human sacrifice. It's just that part. I have numerous countless examples of various murders that are occurring on these mound sites. You can look at them in two ways. It's by sheer coincidence, or a site that used to serve as ancient human sacrifice, used to serve as ritual human sacrifice in America's ancient past, is currently still serving as a ritual human sacrifice in America's modern present time. So that's the way I look at it. And that's going to be a discussion we're going to have next week, but I appreciate bringing that up. It's a good point there, Nick, about the ritual human sacrifice stuff. I'm convinced it's going on. I often wonder what are the goals? What are they trying to achieve with this? And while I think some of them do believe it's some sort of power, I do think there's probably rituals and ceremonies that include trying to provide some sort of embodiment for gods, even if it's only temporary. And I'm not even saying this is something they can achieve. I'm saying this is something that I think some of these cults believe, and I think that's kind of what we saw here. And I often wonder, after rewatching this movie hundreds of times, I've obviously wondered. I wonder if people really believe that there's like some sort of Chinese mystic cult that has some of these concepts in their belief systems.
Well, I think, JJ, this is a really interesting point if we're looking at modern Chinese religion. So, religion like post Boxer Rebellion, post 1750, post Opium Wars, is that it
Sure.
has taken on a very spiritist quality or spiritualist quality of automatic writing, very millenarian, extremely millenarian, a lot
Right.
of goddess cults, particularly goddess cults. And you see a lot of charismatic prophet cults as well, like very similar to the Moonies, but in
Sure.
a
It's a good
more Chinese
example.
style. So where they believe that the person is a reincarnation of a Buddha or say or Lao Tzu or Zhuangzi or some way, some historical or slash religious personages from Chinese history. So there's been tons of them. There's literally
Sure.
thousands and thousands of Chinese millenarian cults. They've been sort of part of the Chinese religious landscape for 3,000 years. There's been many wars about. There was definitely some ancient alien cargo cults going on. If anyone's ever played Dynasty Warriors, the video game, the Yellow Turban Rebellion, so the first campaign you play, is a really famous. Um, that's exactly what I'm talking about. It was like a charismatic leader who said that the king no longer held the mandate of heaven and he was the proper channel of God or heaven.
Right.
So he led a rebellion of hundreds of thousands of peasant farmers against the emperor. So there's it's definitely a part of Chinese cosmology, this like star cult, this asterism worship, as well as these millenarian sort of end of the world doomsday cults. That's definitely a big part of
Sure.
it. Um,
We got a lot of those here in America. Mormons, like you said, the millenarianism, the Millerites were kind of the early onset. The Millerites kind of congregations of the Millerites formed the early congregations of Mormonism. The other half of Millerites, they kind of branched off and would be Seventh Day Adventists and Jehovah's Witnesses. So there's a lot of those end of the world ancient alien cargo cults here. It's interesting to see that some of that astrotheological worship in the Eastern culture as well.
Well, I think that what it is like I said, Chinese people are not extremely religious, although I will say that Tantric Buddhism in particular is now the fastest growing religion in China, mainland China,
Yeah.
as well as Asia proper. Buddhism in general, maybe not just Tantric Buddhism, but in general, they were not extremely religious, especially since obviously Cultural Revolution. A lot of that stuff was only preserved in Hong Kong and Taiwan. So exactly like where you have the primary places where the triads lived. So maybe you could also say that the sort of wiping out of the religious traditions in mainland China concentrated the secret societies in places where they are like deeply connected with religion. Whereas
Okay.
the triad in mainland China, they are very influenced by the internet. You see a lot of like O9A materials in Chinese and like these sort of.
Oh, really?
Oh yeah, this is a big thing on like the Chinese internet and
Na-
people
Nazi
talk about.
Satanism's taken over Chinese. They've gotten into the Chinese culture, huh?
Well, mainland culture tends to be very materialistic, like because they don't really have religion as a formative sort of experience. They don't even experience like people complain about being raised Christian or Catholic now, but they don't even have that, right? Like most people are raised very a-religious or atheist. So I think there's like these transgressive sort of reinforcing the ideas of materialism. They are very attractive to people, and plus they say, oh, you can get whatever you want, right? And like the O9A
Sure.
stuff is all about like being a living god in many ways. Like it's about like the self apotheosis, but not necessarily in the theurgic way. It's sort of the opposite, actually. Sort of like the shittiest parts of you they emphasize, and instead of it you trying to like work on them, which would be more of a theurgic way, right?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's where the Satanism portion really comes into play there. It's the looking, the deep inward concerns.
Absolutely.
The
I think that's
egotistical aspects of it.
Yeah, so that would appeal much more to like the sort of the post millennial Chinese youth who are raised in just sort of like American capitalist style. Not,
Sure.
I'm not even putting that down. I'm just saying that they were, it's a very materialistic culture. It just is, and so anything that's materialistic, maybe religion, also will appeal to them, and it's very online as well.
Yeah, those are some good points. I guess I just really hadn't realized that it had grown into the Chinese culture like that. Again, Nazi Satanism isn't exactly what I would necessarily think that would be very open to any of the Asian cultures. It just doesn't seem like it would convert very well.
Well, JJ, that there is a line of thinking. I'm not saying that I believe this, but there's a line of thinking that the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, they have had a long association with the Triads as well, particularly in Taiwan. They often use the Triads as a front group to buy guns, drugs, and sell them. Also the same thing, and to launder money. So you could also say that's in like maybe some factions of the Western intelligence agencies, MI6 in particular, they also use these kinds of transgressive ritual magic or transgressive practices on their own population or on outside populations in order to spread sort of these ideas of transgression, social decay, etc.
No, you're on target. You're on target, Jen. That's a great point. They are tools of the intelligence agency, so I shouldn't be so short-sighted to think that they're not in the Asian cultures, because obviously there's a great concern for U.S. intelligence agencies to be in China, and that's not a new concern. So,
I think that this plays. I think that the one thing about China, or maybe modern China, that's interesting from a parapolitical angle is that most people my age, like I'm a mid-millennial, and would consider China to be like more third world in the sense that like it's related to that sort of post-Marcusean Fanonian concept of like, oh, the poor oppressed brown people, like that's more how China is viewed by maybe my cohort. So it's the PLA is never seen to do anything bad. You're not really allowed to, even as someone who comes from that diaspora, you're never allowed to criticize it. It's a big sort of taboo, you could say, because then you're like, oh, your family are like chuds. They don't, you're racist against mainlanders or something. But like, to have the idea that China can also do bad things, that like the military can also do bad things, I think that's much more fair and balanced.
Sure.
Right? Like, and I'm sure this is like just because one faction or one thing doesn't make the whole place or every person evil. It just, the intelligences do what they do.
No, I mean, that's a good point. And relative to some of these things we've been talking about here tonight with these various Tong groups, the Chinatown operations here in America, and the politics here in America, and how some of the stuff that is written into the historical aspects are written into the script here, the plot line of Big Trouble in Little China. Again, 1986, John Carpenter's cinematic masterpiece. Again, one of my favorite films. I cannot recommend this enough. It's I was a youngster when this movie came out, so I was only 5. So I didn't see it at the theater, but I definitely remember seeing it on VHS when I was a very young age. And I was learning later in life that it did not do well at the box office. I was like, how is that possible? This movie was fantastic. It's got action, it's got comedy, it's well written. It's even more intriguing that it's got some of these historical aspects to it. But this guy right here, this was an incident in 2016. This guy right here, San Francisco Chinatown gang leader, quote unquote, shrimp boy, sentenced to life. Now, this dude was doing all sorts of, hood rat stuff, guns, drugs, and people, laundering money, that kind of thing. He was a member of he was a former Triad guy, and he was a leader of a Tong group there. And it goes on to say here which specific ones he was involved, but he was doing business. One of the guys that got taken down in this operation of this guy's here, Mr. Shrimp Boy, was the president of the California State Senate, a fellow by the name of Leland Yee. So we're talking about the upper echelon of California politics, and it's kind of disgusting right here. Leland Yee, gun control advocate, yet they're dealing guns, right? Typical.
Well,
trying to find the what's that?
Well, it makes sense. Like people who would advocate for the strictest gun laws,
right,
would be making the most money off the black market.
Absolutely, making that profit. Yeah, so that's kind of the stuff they had going on here. This guy was, basically working with like you said, like the politics right there, making the strictest gun laws. I can't find the Tong unit. Maybe it's on a different one here. I'll look. Making the strictest gun laws Well, they're dealing the guns, they're dealing drugs, they're money laundering, And again, this guy's in prison for life under all these racketeering charges. But here we go. He was the Chi Kung Tong organization. He was the leader. Is that the dragon head or leader of the San Francisco-based Chi Kung Tong organization? One of these Tong groups there in San Francisco's Chinatown, causing big trouble. Is this a big organization? Is this prominently known?
I'm not familiar with this one, JJ, but I think that it's interesting to note on a parapolitical level that the Cantonese triads are deeply connected to either the Navy, because you have a lot of Chinese military, like Chinese American military families are connected to the Navy, so maybe like an Office of Naval Intelligence, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, same goes with like the Philippines as well. Yeah, for sure.
Yes, and then the Taiwanese, like the more Mandarin speaking triads, they would be more associated with like Virginia, Langley, whatever, like that kind of East Coast. Even though the Taiwanese Americans live a lot on the West Coast, I think they're much more closely tied in with those DC sort of intel agencies, because the truth is Taiwan has always been a bastion for Western naval intelligence, but just Western intelligence in general. And Taiwan used to be ruled by a Japanese military junta, which is really interesting, and nobody seems to remember that history. Yeah,
I'm not exactly familiar with that history either. No. So what ethnic group does this shrimp boy fella come from? I'm not going to pronounce this right. Kwok Chong Chow.
So it sounds Cantonese. It sounds like his name is Cantonese, which is surprising, but it makes sense for California, right? Because you would have families that have been there for 200, maybe 300 even years.
Oh, we cut out. I lose it. Oh, we lost Jen.
Sure sounds like it.
Houston, we have a problem. Yeah, so this guy was seemingly Shrimp Boy here was seemingly involved in one of these Tong units, the triads, right? We got two Jins. Is this possible?
Sorry about that, guys.
No worries.
Okay. Well,
it just seems like this is a good example of some of these parapolitical aspects that are written into the plot line of Big Trouble in Little China. We got Shrimp Boy here causing big trouble in Little China here in the modern era. And he's kind of an interesting character. It seems like he's got this seemingly Chinese Freemasonry connections through the triad. He's the leader of this Tong group there in Chinatown. He's doing business. One of his close constituents and criminal conspirators is the president of the California State Senate. Folks like Governor Moonbeam Jerry Brown was, mum was the word for old Moonbeam when this is popping off. Despite Leland Yee, the senator fellow, being a Democratic Party guy. So Governor Moonbeam Brown was identified by Ed Sanders in his files as being most probably a member of the Process Church. He's had numerous terms as the California governor, was the governor back in 2016 when this occurred. Grew up in Laurel Canyon, dated Linda Ronstadt. Different story altogether. Nonetheless, no one within California politics had any statements really on this. This was all very hush-hush, you know what I mean? So it kind of spoke to me, seeing how that all played out, like, this is clearly a big deal, this political power structure within these Tong units, within the triad, the Chinese Freemasonry. And I just think there's, it's kind of interesting how that's still very relevant today.
Absolutely.
Politics.
I think it's also really interesting to note that a lot of the guys from Silicon Valley have not just Chinese wives, but they're specifically Chinese American wives. So they're like people that have been here for at least 50 families that have at least been here for 50 years, even including Nicole Shanahan, who was married to Sergey Brin. So
that's interesting. I think somebody like what's that turtle looking fella from Kentucky? Mitch McConnell. His wife is the daughter of a Chinese billionaire ship magnate, I believe.
Yes, a Taiwanese. So this is a really important because obviously the emphasis on the sort of future war with Taiwan or whatever. I think that,
so the old China aspect, right? Because they still call themselves China. That's part of that whole one China policy of the UN, right? Like, we don't recognize, and everyone gave Trump a bunch of nonsense about calling Taiwan. first of all, Trump knows what the importance of manufacturing Taiwan plays in America, but they gave him a bunch of crap about calling Taiwan and being like, "Oh, we want to do business with you," because he recognizes them as their own country, and you're not allowed to do that in the world political stage. So it seems interesting that when you have some of these these different ethnic Chinese groups, again, including like the old Republic of China, modern day Taiwan folks.
Well, this is also a really interesting history that we'll have to do another day, because I think it ties in a lot to intels, cartels, and like the movement of people and certain black market goods, is this relationship with Taiwan and the sort of the different, because both Mao and Chiang Kai-shek were funded by the West. So you have to wonder, like, why were they funding this Maoist revolutionary? Why were they funding this sort of more Confucianist or neo-Confucianist warlord? Like, there's something really interesting there. And then how Taiwan developed and became this sort of like old guard, but it also preserved a lot of like very OG Chinese culture that does not really exist in mainland China. So, as Hong Kong as well does. So both of those places obviously get a very bad rap for people like millennials my age, because it's seen as like, oh, if you support Hong Kong or Taiwan, you must be supporting like a color revolution against China. But
Sure.
I think that it's a lot more complicated than that. There's like a lot more sort of like, there's a lot more parapolitics involved in sort of the relationship that the countries and the colonies have with each other.
Maybe even some wizardry involved.
Well, I definitely, I mean, well,
all right. Well, gents, I appreciate Nick, Jen, I appreciate you both joining me here tonight here to get a little GCD. Can I give you guys a few moments for some parting words? And I didn't mean to cut you off, Jen. Did you have everything else you wanted to get into here? Should we ready to call it a close? Just provide some closing words here. What do you say? What do you think?
Oh yeah, totally. But to close,
Yep.
I'll just say, just look at the feng shui of Hong Kong and the banks and the architecture of that. If you think that there is not wizardry at play in international and parapolitics, just look at the architecture and how much money they spend to hire wizards to plan out their buildings, their architecture, and the city itself. So it's very obvious if you look into that. So thank you so much, JJ. I had a blast. Thank you so much, Nick. Obviously, I love being a reject. I love working with both of you, and it was awesome. And one of my favorite movies as well. And I think a really interesting discussion on like it's a lot more complicated film than I think people give it credit for.
For sure. And you got some. I see you're doing some Twitter live streams, some Twitch live streams on your Threshold Saints program. Is that correct?
Oh, yes. So thank you so much, JJ. So I've been hosting what is now going to be a 7-part series. They're about 2 to 3 hours each on what I'm calling the Aeon of the Daughter. So it's kind of like I'm calling it a speculative ontology. It's a mixture of like Telema, Sri Vidya Tantra, Buddhist Tantra, Gnostic Gospels that focus on like this archetype called the daughter. And so a lot of people believe we're going into, like, we're leaving Kali Yuga now and we're going into this new Aeon. So I'm kind of building up like the mythology and the story of what that is.
Nice.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate it, Jen. Nick, you got any closing parting words for us and the folks of the interwebs?
Check out the Occult Rejects. It's on all major podcasts, BitChute, Rumble, and YouTube. And thank you both for tonight. And JJ, thank you very much for letting me come on. I always appreciate it. And Jen, as usual, amazing work. Thank you for what you brought to the show.
Thank you. Thank you both. And let me just, totally. I'll be on several more Rejects episodes coming up. And JJ and I will, JJ is going to come on my show, obviously, eventually. And hopefully do some Tealverse, dissecting that situation.
Relative to my cousin, old JD Vance.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, his puppeteer, Mr. Peter Thiel.
Exactly.
No, I like it. I appreciate you joining me, Jen. Again, you're welcome back anytime. We'll do some more esoteric occult film reviews or other topics as well, such as the Tealverse. And folks of the interwebs, I appreciate y'all joining us here. Hope folks enjoyed the conversation. seem to be in the chat. I got these gentlemen's link trees in the show notes already. There we go. I couldn't think of it for a second. And I got mine as well. And Operation GCD Patreon, where I'm putting out a double dose of Operation GCD shenanigans. Got that scrolling on the bottom of the screen, and you can find that in my link tree. And until next time, appreciate it, gents.
Well, that's it. That's the show here, folks. So the next time you're out on the town, visiting your local watering holes, or perhaps just meandering around, and you hear the unmistakable sounds of metal clanking, and you spot signs of a disturbance, well, check your six. Look in that garbage can, because you never can tell. The GCDs may be loose in your town.